Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're continuing our series of YouTube instructional videos to help you play chess better. One of the video series that I thought I'd have to do sooner was king and pawn against king. And generally it takes about an hour to do that, so I'm going to break it into two videos. So this is part one. The goal is, if I randomly drop a king and a pawn and a king on the board, and I say to you, evaluate the position, there's going to be two evaluations. One is going to be what would be the evaluation of what would happen if both sides played perfectly and it was white's move, and the other would be what would happen if it was black's move. So for instance, here I dropped a random position on the board, and hopefully if you drop these pieces on the board and you quickly look at it and you say, what's the right evaluation? The answer would be white to play, black should be able to draw with perfect play, black to play, black should be able to draw with perfect play, so therefore this position is a draw with either side to move if they play perfectly. And that's the goal. The goal is to be able to evaluate these positions. Now, why, and not only evaluate them, but of course know how to play them. Now, why do we start with positions like this? Well, if you're studying the opening, you're going to study a position that starts like this every time. And you're going to work your way into the opening. You know, if you're learning a d-pawn opening, you're going to start with d4. If you're learning an e-pawn opening, you're going to start with e4. And you're going to work your way into the opening. With endgames, it's exactly the other way around. You start with basically nothing, and you work your way to more and more complicated positions. Well, the first two endgames that you generally want to learn would be king and queen against king, where there's no pawns on the board. And the next one would be something like king and rook against king. Again, no pawns on the board, and learn how to checkmate. But soon after that, you're going to get into endgames where pawns are involved, and you just can't study endgames with multiple pawns without knowing what happens with one pawn. For instance, suppose white has two pawns and black has one, and black's king is back here, and you want to know if f4 is a good move. Well, the problem is, if you study this and you don't know king and pawn against king, you don't know for white if you should be playing f4, because you're giving black the opportunity to trade pawns and get into an endgame that looks like this. And if you're black and white plays f4, and you don't know king and pawn against king, you don't know whether you should take the pawn or not. So it doesn't make any sense to study king and two pawns against king and one pawn if you don't know about king and one pawn against zero. You got to kind of work your way backward from less pieces on the board up to more. Same thing if you had a rook. Let's say white has a rook on f3, and black has a king here, and black has a rook over here. And it's black's move, and black wants to know, is it a reasonable defense to play rook to f5? If you don't know king and pawn endgames, you don't know whether black should be doing this, whether this is a good idea for black to offer this trade or not. And it doesn't make sense to study rook and pawn against rook if you don't know king and pawn against king first. So basically, all endgames with pawns on, you need to know king and pawn against king, so that when you study those endgames with more pieces, and there's possibility of trades, you know whether or not those trades are going to be good for you or not. Whether you're black and trying for a draw if you're down a pawn, or whether you're white and you're trying for a win. Okay, so let's get right to king and pawn against king. And what we're going to do is we're going to separate it into four cases. The first case is where the king that has the pawn, we'll always make it white just to make it easy in the videos, but the king and the pawn, the king can't help the pawn. So what kind of position would that be? That would be a position that looks something like this. The black king has the white king blocked off. And what we have here is just a race. It's a race between the white pawn and the black king. We could even move the black king one closer to make it more clear that the white king can't help the pawn here. And here, if white tries to bring the king over, the black king is just going to come over and take the pawn. So it's going to be a race. Now, when I've tested people on positions like this, of course, we use what's called the rule of the square, where you compare the square that the pawn is to the queening square to where the defending king is. And the square looks something like this. You draw the line up there. It's 6 long. A square is always going to be an exact square, and it's going to look something like that. So the rule of the square says if the defending king, in this case black king, cannot move into the square of the pawn, then the pawn will queen, and if it can move into the square, then it can catch the pawn. The problem is when I test students, they don't know that this rule can only be applied if it's black's move, if it's the king's move. They try to apply they know the rule, but they try to apply it when it's white's move, and that doesn't make sense. So what I tell people is when you have these kind of positions and you're looking for the rule of the square, you have to move the pawn first and then create the square. Why is this so important? Why can't you do it with black? Well, first of all, the tempos are wrong with black, but even more important, if it's the pawn's move, the pawn has the opportunity to move up 2, in which case it's moving faster than the king. And once it moves up 2, it can no longer move up 2 again. So if you do it after the pawn's move, when it's the king's move, then you never have to worry about the pawn moving 2 because the pawn is already moved. So it's going to be black's it's going to be black's move when you do it. Now suppose it was black's move in this position, and you had to see could he get inside the square. What you would do is you would kind of mentally make black's move. Let's make it black's move here. You'd make it black's move. He's heading toward the promotion square. Then you would move white's pawn 2, and now you would create the square now that the pawn has moved. And not only can the king get inside the square, it already is inside the square. So therefore, the king is plenty close here. Let's put the pawn over on the rook file and do that again. Let's say it's black's move here. Can black catch the pawn? Black's going to move toward the promoting square. The pawn's going to move 2. Then we're going to draw the square. Can the black king get inside the square? Yes, he can. So therefore, this will be a draw. King g7, just for the fun of it, queen, king takes. All right, so again, the rule is you don't want to draw the square till after the pawn moves and it's the black's move. So in this position, let's say it's white's move. White will move the pawn here. Let's make it white's move. White will move the pawn here, and now we can draw the square. You draw the moves up to the promotion square. You draw the same number of squares out toward the king. You complete the square. We now have this 5x5 square. The black king cannot get in front of the pawn. Therefore, in this position, white to play wins h4. He can't get inside the square. This is actually pretty easy. In these positions where the white king cannot help the pawn, and it's just a race between the black king and the white pawn, you simply make sure it's the black king's move after the pawn has moved. Draw the square. If the king can get inside the square, he can catch it. If he can't, he can't. Now, when there's more pawns on the board and pawns are blocking the king's path, well, you know, this can become a lot more complicated. But right now, we're trying to learn king and pawn against king. And again, our goal is if we drop a random king and a random pawn and a random king on the board, we want to be able to evaluate white to play. Can white win? Is it a draw? Black to play. Can black draw? Or is it a white win? You're looking always to evaluate both, because when you get a position, even though in a real game it's always going to be white's move or black's move, it could be either. And when you're studying, you don't know when you get to a game whose move it's going to be. So you need to know both sides' moves. All right, so in here we've got the basic race between the king and the pawn. We use the rule of the square. Why does the rule of the square work? Well, it's because once the pawn moves 2, after that, the king and the pawn can move exactly at the same speed, even though the king can go diagonal. So when the king goes here, he's going to be moving up at the same rate the pawn is, and he's going to be moving over one file at a time. So here he's moving 1 closer, and every time white goes up a rank, he can move 1 closer, and he just can't get there. The fastest he can go is on the diagonal, and white gets the queen. And again, if we move the black king 1 closer, and the pawn goes here, the square is here, since the black king can get inside the square and he can get this corner in 4 moves, and white is going to take 4 moves. 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4. He catches him. So that's why the rule of the square works. All right, let's go to the next case. The next case is there's a rook pawn on the board, but the king can help the rook pawn. In that case, if the king can help the rook pawn, the rule is fairly easy. If the white king, we're assuming now that, again, the black king is close enough that a race won't work for white, and here it is. Race is not going to work. What the rule is in positions like this is, if, assuming the black king can catch the pawn, if the king can get into the corner, then it's a draw. If the white king can get to g7 or g8 and keep the black king out of the corner, it's a win for white. And if the white king is stuck in the corner and the black king can get to f7 or f8, then it's a draw. So let's look at this position with white to play. All right, we've already seen just pushing the pawn doesn't work. Black's going to catch it. So therefore, we're going to need the king. So we bring the king up. Black's going to try to get to the corner. White's going to try to cut him off. White tries to cut him off. Black king races toward the corner. And we see black's king is going to get in the corner. So even with white to play here, this position is a draw. We can even ask the computer, Mr. Computer, am I right? Computer goes, yes, Dan, you're right. Okay, so this position is a draw. Let's show one where white would be winning. Let's say white's king is already here. Black's king is here. Okay, so this is white to play. If white's king runs up too fast, he can just barely win here. So he's got to watch out for the king coming underneath. So the easier way to win this position with white move is you play h4, and then when the king moves, you keep blocking him out. You block him out, the king comes back, you block him out, and this is now a win. You just push the pawn straight in to win. If this position is black to play, let's make it black to play, and black moves first, then white plays here and blocks him out. If black tries to run around this way, you push the pawn in. You can't do that. So king here, king d7, king here. I actually saw somebody in this position make the mistake of playing h4. And now black has that magic square f8. Why is that magic? Well, white can keep him out of the corner, but the cost to keep the black king out of the corner now is to put the white king in the corner and block his own pawn. So if white goes here with king here, black now just goes back and forth on these two squares, and if white ever brings the king out, black will get into the corner, and if he doesn't bring the king out, he's going to stalemate himself. So let's take a look at that. Black's move, black plays king f7, h6, king f8. If white now comes out, black goes in the corner, draw. White has a choice of stalemating or letting him take the pawn. If white doesn't come out of the corner, if white keeps pushing the pawn, now he has to go in the corner. Black goes here, king here, pawn here, here. And if white ever pushes the pawn, king here, draw. So what did white do wrong here? He played that pawn to h4 on the third move. Let's go all the way back to the start. King here, king here, king here. You can't let him get to this square. You have to play here. And now king here, pawn push. Black says, okay, can I get him this way? Nope, not in time. Win. So here in this position with black to play, white's winning because black's king can't force the white king in the corner and black's king can't get to the corner. So again, we have the 4 critical squares when we have the rook pawn. The critical squares are if white can get his king to g7 or g8. Of course, if it's an A pawn, if it's a rook pawn on the other side, the key squares are going to be b7 and b8. But with an H pawn, if white king can get to g7 and g8 or g8 without losing the pawn, then he's going to win. If black's king can get to the corner, then black's king is going to draw. And if black's king can get white's king to go in the corner and black's king can get to f7 or f8, then that's a draw. We can't just say if black's king can get to f7 or f8, it's a draw, because what if the white king doesn't have to go in the corner? So for instance, let's just play some silly moves here. Suppose white plays h4 and black plays king d5 and h5, king here, king here, king here, pawn here, king here. And if you said, gee, if the king gets to f8, it's always a draw, that's not true, because the white king doesn't have to go in the corner. White can just play h7, and black has not access to g7 or g8. And even though white's king isn't on the critical square, white's winning here. So when we say the critical squares for black are h7, h8, f7, f8, f7 and f8 are only critical squares if he can force the white king to get in front of the pawn. But if black's king gets to h7 or h8, then it's always going to be a draw. And of course, if we start with black's king in front of the pawn or anywhere near, it's a trivial draw. Black will just run his king back. For instance, suppose in this position white has a white squared bishop. Let's say he's got a bishop on d1. Now we know from more advanced endgames, and we don't want to go too much into this, that a bishop that controls the promotion square on a rook pawn is going to win, and if it doesn't, if the king get in the corner, it's a draw. And you might look at this position and say, I have no idea if I can stop him from getting in the corner. But actually you do, because black has a path here where he can go on all dark squares and run to the corner, and there's nothing a bishop can do about it. So therefore, with black to move in this position, even with white to move, it's a draw. White can't do anything about black, no matter where white goes here. King to g1, king here, bishop here, king here. Black's not going to pay any attention to what white's doing. He's just going to run into the corner. So even with a bishop of the wrong color, this is a draw, which shows you if we take the bishop off the board, black doesn't have to get any tempos or opposition or anything like that. He simply heads his king back to the corner. He doesn't care what white's doing. He gets back to the corner here, draw. If you don't believe me, we'll push the pawn up. We could put our king in front and get the opposition. It doesn't matter. And white has a choice of giving up the pawn or stalemate with a draw. So case number 2 is there's an A pawn or an H pawn, and it's not a race anymore. The offensive king can help the pawn, but the defensive king is in the area. It doesn't matter whether the offensive king is in front of the pawn, the side of the pawn, behind the pawn. The only thing that matters is, can the offensive king get to those critical squares so the pawn can run in? Can the defensive king either get to the corner or block the offensive king in the corner? If he can block the offensive king in the corner, draw. Let's do that one more time. Let's put the king here. We'll put the black king here. We'll put a white pawn here. We'll take those other guys off the board. All right, so this is white to play. If white keeps going back and forth, obviously he won't get any progress. He's blocking his own pawn. At some point, black will claim threefold repetition of position. But if white comes out of the corner, black goes into the corner. And now if white pushes the pawn, we have an immediate draw. And if white doesn't push the pawn, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether black goes back diagonal or straight. Let's say he goes back diagonal. He goes here. And eventually push the pawn, stalemate, draw. Okay, so rook pawns are pretty easy. Races are pretty easy. What are the only cases that take a little thought? And those are cases where it's not a rook pawn and it's not a race. And those are the cases that we started with when we first showed you the position where I had something like, king here and pawn here and, king here. These are the kind of positions that are more interesting because black obviously can get in front of the pawn. White obviously can guard his pawn. And the question is, who's winning? And the best way to start these kind of positions is to start where the kings are already right next to the pawn. And there's basically the third case and the fourth case. The third case is the king is not in front of the pawn, and the fourth case is the king is in front of the pawn. And when I say in front, I don't mean directly in front. I mean, let's define what we mean by in front. If I have a king on a higher rank than a pawn, but I'm way off to the side, that's not in front. So king on h4 is not in front, but I don't have to be directly in front either. What I'm really generally referring to as in front is on some exact file, same file as the pawn, or maybe an adjacent file. And we'll talk about the differences when we get there. But in front means the king is on a higher rank than the pawn is, but not way, way, way off to the side. So here, if white says, I'm going to get my king in front of the pawn and I'm going to play here and I'm on the fourth rank, this doesn't really help the pawn much at all. The king has to be near the pawn so he's not just losing the pawn. This is obvious, but we have to state it so that when we use the word in front, people know what we mean. We don't mean necessarily if the pawn's on d3, we're on d4. That can be directly in front, and we're going to look at that case. Now, a lot of people get confused because they think the opposite, if I say not in front, that the opposite of in front is behind the pawn. But the opposite of in front of the pawn is not behind the pawn, because there's another case. There's the case that looks something like this. Here, the white king is not in front of the pawn, but he's also not behind the pawn. He's on the side of the pawn. Generally, you want to put the cases where the king is in front together. That's one case. And the case where he's not in front is another case. So that actually includes the case where he's on the side or he's behind. As long as he's not in front of the pawn, it's basically the same case. So let's start with the king directly behind the pawn. Okay, we're going to look at this case. And we have to look at white to move and black to move. And we have to ask ourselves, does it make a difference? And the answer is no. White to play, this is a draw. Black to play, this is a draw. And that means we can create a rule. And these rules are very, very important. The rule here is going to be if you have a non-rook pawn and the defending king is somewhere in front of the pawn so that the offensive king cannot easily get in front, and right now the offensive king is not in front of the pawn, then the game, no matter who's to move, the game is always a draw if both sides play perfectly. Now, a lot of people teach this rule where they teach people if white plays king to e2, black has to go straight back. And it's true, if black goes straight back, he can get a draw. But he actually has 4 legal moves, and 3 of them get a draw. He can move back diagonally. He can move back diagonally the other way to e5. It's all a draw. If you give someone a rule that they have to move straight back, it's true they can draw by moving straight back. But in this position, they don't have to. Why is that important? It's very important because suppose black has his king not in front of the pawn. Suppose it's white to play, or sorry, suppose it's black to play, and black's king is on b6. And when black was taking lessons from someone, they said, if your king's in front of the pawn, you have to go straight back. And now they look at this position and they panic because they go, uh-oh, my king's not in front of the pawn. I can't go straight back. I don't know what to do. I don't know whether I'm drawing or not. So the actual rule that's a much more powerful rule than moving the king straight back is if you can keep the white king from going in front of the pawn before the pawn gets to the 6th rank, then it's a draw. So in this case, if it's black to move and black plays, let's say, king to c6, and white tries to get in front of the pawn with king to e3, and black plays king to d5. This is a draw. So my rule, which is different than going straight back rule, is don't let the king in front as long as the pawn's not up to the 6th rank. If you know that rule, now you don't have to worry about your king being on d4 here. If your king is on b6, you're covered. You could play king c6 and get a draw by playing this way. You could also play king c5. It doesn't make any difference. And go here, and you're still getting a draw. The same thing would be true if the king was like back here on f7 and it's black's move. Black plays here, white plays here, and now black doesn't matter. He doesn't need to be on the same file with the white king. It doesn't matter. As long as he plays a move that stops the white king from getting in front of the pawn, he can get his draw. That's why I tell people, teaching people to go straight back works wonderful if you start with the king already in front of the pawn. But if the defending king is not in front of the pawn, that rule is going to drive them crazy because they're not going to know what to do. So the better rule, which covers all the cases, not just the case where he's in front, is if you can stop the king from getting in front in these kind of positions, you can get a draw. Now, the second rule you need to know occurs when the pawn gets to the 6th rank. So let's do that. d4, black has 4 moves here. Again, the pawn's not on the 6th rank. King to c4 loses to king here because the white king will get it in front of the pawn and the black king won't be able to stop him from coming up. But king here, c6, king e4, king d6, d5. Again, black can go any of these lines. It doesn't matter. A lot of people bring the king up here and they go, oh, I've got the opposition. No, you don't. This is not the opposition when there's a pawn in the way. It's only the opposition when you're in front of the pawn. The fact that it's black's move here is irrelevant. It could also be white's move. It doesn't matter. There is no opposition here. King d7, and at some point, white's going to push the pawn. Now, you can't just go anywhere. Now, if you go back diagonally, the tempos will be wrong, and you'll lose the game. So let's show that. King here, king here. I don't call this the opposition. I just call this the wrong tempos. King to d8, d7, black's in zugzwang. He has to bring the king out. White plays the king up. He gets a queen, and he wins. Same thing if black goes here. Transposes to the same thing. King c8 question mark. King e6, king d8, d7, zugzwang. King to c7, king e7 wins. So the rule black has to follow, the second rule, is when the pawn gets to the 6th rank, now you've got to be able to go straight back or get to this d8 square to get a draw. If you can't play king d8 here, then you're in big trouble. So black plays king d8, white plays king e6. Now you can't let the king in front of the pawn. If you let the king in front of the pawn, he's going to win. So obviously black plays here, white checks, black plays here, and now white has a choice of draws. He could draw by insufficient mating material by letting black take the pawn, or he can stalemate black by playing king d6. So let's go through that again. Black to play and draw. King here, king here. Do not let the king in front of the pawn, giant mistake. Follow rule number 1, don't let the king in front of the pawn. At some point, white will push the pawn. You can go straight back there if you want to. It's not necessary. Now the pawn's in the 6th rank. Go in front. And now you have to go straight back. It doesn't matter whether the king is on c5, d5, or e5. You got to go straight back. If you go diagonal, he'll come in the same direction. He'll put you in zugzwang. I'm going to win. I do not call this the opposition because if the pawns were further back, it wouldn't even matter. Here it matters because of the tempos, not because of the opposition. He squeezes them out. So therefore, in this position, you must go straight back. If you want to always go straight back, because it always works, that's great. I just want you to know from this video, you don't have to do that. King up, king here, pawn up, king here, draw. Okay, we're going to continue reviewing that case where the king is defending in back of the pawn. And in the next video, we're going to look at cases where the offensive king is already in front of the pawn. And we're going to look at some of the more distant opposition cases as well. And that'll conclude king and one pawn against king. I can't cover everything, but if we cover some of the distant opposition cases, that'll cover like 95%, if not 99%, of king and pawn against king. Okay, so join me for part 2 when we continue with this. We covered the first 3 cases. We covered the race case, the rook pawn case, and the king is not in front case, which is not the same as king behind because the king can be on the side. We've covered those 3 cases. We'll continue with the next video. See you then. Bye.